Don Whitfield looked at me from across the head of that conference table, hands flat on the surface like he was steadying himself, and said, "This company carries the Whitfield name, Marcus. It always will. And Garrett is a Whitfield." The room had 11 people in it. Project managers I'd brought on myself. Site supervisors who had been taking my calls at 6 in the morning for the better part of a decade. My senior estimator, Linda, who had been with me since before we landed our first municipal contract. She was sitting 2 seats to my left, and I watched her jaw tighten the way it does when she's working very hard not to say something out loud. Nobody else moved. Nobody looked at me directly. The air conditioning was running, and the blinds were half drawn against the afternoon sun. And outside in the lot, I could hear one of the crew trucks idling near the gate. Inside, the only sound was the hum of the projector nobody had remembered to turn off. That was the moment. A Thursday afternoon in September, in a conference room on the second floor of a building I had helped design the interior layout for, in a commercial construction company I had spent 19 years turning into something real. My name is Marcus Gale. I'm 53 years old, and for 19 years, I ran the operational core of Whitfield Construction out of Nashville, Tennessee. I should start further back. I met Dana at a charity auction in Brentwood when I was 33. She was raising her paddle for a weekend in the Smokies, and I outbid her because I wasn't paying close enough attention to the number on the card, and also because she laughed when I realized what I'd done. We had dinner that same night. 6 months later, we were engaged. Her father, Don Whitfield, ran a mid-sized commercial construction company, maybe 20 full-time employees, a handful of active projects at any given time, and a reputation in the Nashville market that was solid but not growing. Don offered me a position about a year into the marriage. Project coordinator. He knew I'd come out of civil engineering, that I'd spent 6 years at a mid-level firm in Memphis before Dana and I got together, and that I understood the gap between what a project looks like on paper and what it costs to actually build it. He said he could use someone who thought the way I did. I took the job because Dana asked me to, and because, honestly, I could see exactly where the company was bleeding and I thought I could fix it. I wasn't wrong about that. First year, I restructured the subcontractor bidding process and cut average project overhead by 12%. Second year, I built an estimating model from scratch on my personal laptop, a system that factored in material cost volatility, labor availability by zip code, and permit timeline variables across Davidson, Williamson, and Rutherford counties. I built it on my own time, over a winter, using industry data I'd compiled myself across 3 years in Memphis. Third year, I walked that model into the City of Nashville procurement office and used it to submit the lowest compliant bid on a municipal parking structure on 2nd Avenue North. We won $740,000, the first government contract Whitfield had ever held. Don gave me the VP of Operations title in year 5. No equity discussion, no formal ownership conversation, just a title and a salary that felt fair at the time and stopped keeping pace with the company around year 11. By the time I was in year 15, Whitfield Construction had 63 employees, active projects in 4 counties, and 3 standing municipal contracts with the city of Nashville totaling just over $4 million annually. We had a relationship with the Metro Public Works Office that had taken me personally 8 years to build, not Whitfield the company, not Don's name, mine. The project liaisons in that office knew my direct number. They called me when scope changed. They called me when permit timelines shifted. They called me because I was the person who showed up, who understood their constraints, and who had never once left them with a problem I hadn't already thought through. Don understood that. In a general way, he understood it. What he never fully grasped was what it meant. Garrett Whitfield was 29 when he came back from getting his MBA at Vanderbilt. He was sharp in the way people are sharp when they've been told they're sharp their entire lives, confident, quick with the vocabulary, good at walking into a room and taking up space. What he couldn't do was read a set of structural drawings, couldn't tell you why a commercial pour requires a different spec than residential, couldn't explain why you never lowball a project that touches metro sewer infrastructure because the change order risk will eat you alive. I know because I spent 14 months trying to teach him. Don had brought him in as a strategic development officer, which was a title we invented for the occasion. The plan, as Don explained it to me privately, was to give Garrett time to learn the operation from the inside, get his footing on live projects, and then work toward an expanded leadership role. He used the phrase, phased transition. He said it in a way that suggested we would have more conversations about what it meant. We didn't have those conversations. What happened instead was that Garrett started sitting in on my client calls. He started attending the metro procurement meetings I'd spent years cultivating. He started carbon copying Don on emails that had previously just gone between me and the project teams. None of it aggressive, just accumulative, like someone quietly learning the shape of a room before deciding how to rearrange it. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was being included in a succession plan, that this was what a healthy handoff looked like, that there would be a real conversation about my role in the next chapter. Don was 67. A transition made sense. I just assumed I would be part of it rather than replaced by it. The annual operations review was always held in September. I'd run it every year for the past 12. I sat down at that table on a Thursday afternoon with a prepared summary of our Q3 project margins and a proposal for a new county contract I'd been positioning us to win since spring. Don opened the meeting by thanking the team for a strong quarter. Then he said that effective the 1st of October, Garrett would be assuming the role of Vice President of Operations and taking full responsibility for all active project oversight and client relationships. He looked at me once when he said it, just once, and then away, toward the window over the parking lot. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, what my role would be in the restructured organization. And Don said what he said. I sat through the rest of that meeting. I answered a question about the county contract timeline. I made a note on my legal pad that I didn't actually look at. When it was over, I shook Garrett's hand in the doorway and told him congratulations. And I meant it in the specific way you mean something when you're operating on the surface of yourself, while something else entirely is happening underneath. I walked downstairs, got in my truck, and drove home. Dana was in the kitchen when I came in. She looked at my face and didn't ask how the meeting went. She already knew. Don had called her that morning. She said, "I told him this was wrong, Marcus." I said, "I know." She said, "He didn't listen." I said, "He never does." We sat at the kitchen table for a long time that night. I told her I needed a few days to think before I decided anything. She said, take whatever time I needed, and that she was with me regardless of what I decided. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she says things she's already decided are true. What I didn't tell her yet was that I'd started thinking in the parking lot. I took 4 days. Told the office I was working remotely on the county contract proposal, which was technically accurate. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad and went through everything, methodically, the way I go through a project estimate. On the second day, I pulled up my employment contract from when I'd first joined Whitfield. Don's attorney at the time had been a general practice guy in Brentwood who primarily handled residential closings and the occasional small business incorporation. The contract was 6 pages. There was no intellectual property assignment clause. There was no non-compete. There was a non-solicitation provision that covered current employees but said nothing about client relationships or government procurement contacts. I opened the estimating model I'd built on my personal laptop in that first winter, the one I'd been updating every year since. 19 versions, all saved to a personal drive, none of them on Whitfield's company server, because when I built it, we didn't have a company server worth the name. The system that had won us every municipal contract we'd ever held, the one that Garrett had sat in rooms watching me run without understanding what he was looking at, had never been formally transferred to Whitfield Construction. I'd never thought to ask for compensation for it. I'd never thought to protect it. I was building something I believed in, and I was inside a family. And inside a family, you don't think about leverage. That was a specific kind of mistake. I understood it clearly now. Then I looked at the 3 active municipal contracts. I pulled the actual documents, copies I kept in a personal folder for reference. The City of Nashville contracts all listed me as the designated project, operational contact, with my direct number in the performance and communication clause. 2 of them had language I had drafted myself during negotiations years ago that specified the city's right to request continuity of the named operational lead as a condition of ongoing performance compliance. I had written that clause to protect the company's relationships. I had not understood until that Tuesday night what else it protected. I read it 3 times, slowly. Then I closed the laptop. I want to say what I felt at that moment because it would be easy to frame it wrong. I didn't feel clever. I didn't feel like I'd found a secret door in a wall. I felt tired in a way that had been accumulating for years and had finally become impossible to pretend wasn't there. I'd spent 19 years treating Whitfield's problems as my problems because I couldn't tell the difference anymore. I'd shown up early and stayed late and taken the Sunday phone calls and eaten the credit disappearing upstairs because that was the deal, the unspoken deal you make inside a family business when you married in and not born in. The deal, it turns out, was entirely one-sided, and I had agreed to it without reading the terms. I thought about Ray Castillo. Ray ran Meridian Build Group out of Franklin. We'd been on opposite sides of 4 or 5 municipal bids over the years. He was the kind of competitor you respected, precise, professional, never sloppy. He'd called me personally after we both submitted on a Metro library renovation 2 years back and asked if I wanted to grab lunch and compare notes on the city's procurement timeline changes. I'd declined because it felt like a conflict at the time, but we'd stayed loosely connected. He'd sent me a message 8 months ago, informal, direct, that said he was expanding his municipal division and that if I ever found myself in a different situation, he'd like to have a real conversation. I had filed it away under loyalty. Under not yet. Under the assumption that eventually the people you build something for start to see what you built. I called him on the 4th day. He picked up on the 2nd ring and said, "Marcus, I figured it might be you eventually." We met the following Tuesday at a barbecue place in Franklin. Neither of us had to drive far to reach. No neutral territory power games. Just 2 people who knew the same industry and could talk about it without needing to explain the basics first. Ray was 51, built like someone who'd poured concrete before he'd learned to read a budget. He asked specific questions about municipal relationship management, metro procurement cycles, subcontractor compliance in the Davidson County pipeline. He didn't ask me to justify my experience. He just listened and then asked the next question. The offer was $185,000 base, 7% profit sharing tied to the municipal division, director of project operations overseeing 2 regional teams. And then he said something I'd been waiting 19 years to hear in a professional context. Your name goes on every contract you develop. And that estimating model you've built, I've heard about it from 2 different procurement contacts. If you developed it on your own time with your own resources, we have a formal acquisition process. You get credited, you get compensated, and it becomes part of how Meridian operates going forward. I drove home that evening thinking about the model sitting on my personal drive. 19 years of refinement, every material cost curve, every labor rate variable, every county-specific permit pattern I'd mapped and cataloged. It had never belonged to Whitfield. It had just lived there, the way a lot of things I built had lived there without anyone formally asking who they belonged to. Dana was still up when I got in. We sat at the kitchen table, the way we'd been sitting at kitchen tables through every important conversation of our marriage, and I told her everything Ray had said. She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "My father built the name on the building. You built everything the building does." She said it simply, the way she says true things. Not to hurt anyone, just as a fact that had been true for a long time and deserved to be said out loud. I told her I was going to call Ray back in the morning. She said, "Good." I called Ray the next morning, told him I was in. We settled on a start date 3 weeks out. That afternoon, I wrote my resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice, clean, no editorializing, printed on plain paper. I typed it on my personal computer. That felt right. Before I walked it downstairs, I did something else. I opened my email and drafted 3 separate messages. One to each of my primary contacts in the Metro Nashville procurement office, the 3 liaisons I'd worked with across the municipal contracts currently in place. People I had genuine professional relationships with, built over years of showing up prepared and following through without exception. Not Whitfield relationships. Mine, the emails were professional and brief. I informed each of them that I would be transitioning out of my role at Whitfield Construction, that my last day would be in 2 weeks, and that going forward I could be reached through Meridian Build Group in Franklin. I included Ray's company contact information and noted that I would be personally leading municipal operations in my new capacity. I didn't say anything negative about Whitfield. I didn't editorialize. I notified relevant parties of a change in my contact information, which I was fully within my rights to do, and in 2 of the 3 contracts, was technically obligated to do under the communication clause. I sent all 3 emails. Then I walked the resignation letter to Don's office. He was reviewing something on his computer when I knocked and came in. He looked up, and I put the letter on his desk. He read it the way you read something you're not ready to read slowly, then again. Then he set it down and looked at me across the desk. He said, 2 weeks. I said yes. He asked where I was going. I told him Meridian. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite anger, more like the expression of a man who had just heard a sound in the structure of a building and wasn't sure yet how serious it was. He asked if we could discuss a different arrangement, maybe a senior advisory role alongside Garrett. I told him about the Meridian offer. He said Ray Castillo was overpaying and that he'd be curious to see how that worked out. I told him that was between me and Ray. Then he said he hoped this wouldn't create friction with Dana and the family. I told him Dana and I were in complete agreement. He looked at the letter again. Then he said, I built this company from a single crew truck and a handshake reputation, Marcus. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the municipal contracts with my name in the performance clause. I thought about the estimating model on my personal drive. I thought about the Sunday phone calls and the 6 a.m. emails and the 9 years of salary that hadn't kept pace with the revenue I'd produced. I said, You built a crew truck and a handshake, Don. I built the company you have now. We both know that. I left before he could respond. The 2 weeks that followed were the kind of strange that endings always are when one side hasn't accepted that something is ending. People I'd barely spoken to in years suddenly wanted to grab coffee. The senior site supervisor, a man named Cal who'd been with me for 12 years and never said much beyond what needed to be said, stopped by my desk and shook my hand and told me he was sorry to see me go. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. We both understood what my leaving meant for the people who did the real work at Whitfield Construction. Garrett started coming by my desk with questions. The Metro contract renewal timelines, how the procurement office preferred to receive change order documentation, why we structured our compliance reports the way we did and not the standard format. I answered every question completely and honestly. If I was going to leave, I was going to leave with my integrity intact. But there were 2 things I didn't hand over. The first was the estimating model. Garrett didn't know to ask for it because he didn't fully understand what it was. To him, Whitfield just submitted competitive bids and generally won. He hadn't traced that back to a specific tool built on a personal drive, updated through 19 iterations. Nobody asked me about it directly. I wasn't going to offer it. The second thing was the depth of my relationships in the procurement office. On my last Friday, Garrett stopped by around 3 in the afternoon and asked if I'd set up a courtesy introduction call with my Metro contacts before I left so he could start building those relationships. I gave him every name, every office number, every email address in the public contract files. What I didn't tell him was that those contacts had heard from me 10 days ago, that they already had Meridian's information, that when Garrett called those numbers on Monday morning and introduced himself as the new VP of operations at Whitfield Construction, he'd be talking to people who already knew exactly where I'd gone and who were already having internal conversations about what that meant for their ongoing contract relationships. I wasn't burning anything down. I was just done carrying water. I was no longer being paid to carry. I cleaned out my desk that last Friday afternoon. My personal drive went into my bag first. A framed photo of Dana, me, and our daughter Sophie at the Vanderbilt graduation 2 springs ago. Sophie, in her cap and gown, grinning like she'd just run the table. A coffee mug that had been on my desk so long I'd stopped seeing it. Nothing else belonged to me. On the way out, I walked through the project room and looked at the wall of active project boards, 14 active sites, every one of them running on processes I'd built, timelines I'd structured, subcontractor relationships I'd spent years developing. Through the window, I could see the equipment yard, company trucks lined up in the late afternoon light. I walked out at 5 o'clock on a Friday and didn't look back. My first week at Meridian felt like adjusting to a different altitude. Not better or worse immediately, just different in ways that accumulated. Nobody asked my father-in-law's opinion on my decisions. When I walked into a project meeting and said something, the room moved on it. Ray had given me a real office door, nameplate, a window facing the Franklin skyline. After 12 years of an open floor plan desk because open floor plans promote collaboration, I noticed. I spent the first 2 weeks the way I always start in a new operation, listening before speaking, mapping before moving. I sat with the estimators, walked 2 active sites with the project managers, reviewed the last 8 months of Metro bid submissions. I found 3 structural inefficiencies in the bidding process within the first 10 days that nobody had flagged because nobody had the same county-specific data I'd been accumulating for 19 years. Ray didn't hover. He checked in once a day, asked one question, and trusted me to work. That was new. It shouldn't have been new, but it was. We began integrating the estimating model into Meridian's operations in week 3. Ray had run it through the formal acquisition process he'd described over lunch, documented, appraised at fair market value, my name on the filing. The dollar amount wasn't life-changing. That wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in 19 years, something I had built was officially, legally, unambiguously mine, and then mine to transfer on my own terms to a company that understood what they were acquiring. By the end of the second quarter, Meridian's bid accuracy on Metro projects had improved measurably. Our competitive win rate on municipal submissions went up. On-time delivery performance across the active project portfolio improved enough that Ray included the numbers in our state contractor recertification documents, which were being filed in connection with a significant bid for the Metro Nashville Parks and Recreation Infrastructure expansion, a 3-year contract covering capital improvement work across 11 sites on both sides of the river, a contract that Whitfield Construction had held the last cycle. Both companies submitted bids. I knew Whitfield's cost structure better than Garrett did. I knew where their margins were thin, where their subcontractor relationships had gaps, which county compliance requirements had been handled by institutional memory rather than documented process, meaning the moment I left, nobody at Whitfield could reconstruct why we made the choices we made. I didn't use any proprietary Whitfield information in Meridian's bid. I didn't need to. I just built the most accurate, compliant, competitively priced proposal I could with Meridian's actual capabilities. And Meridian's actual capabilities, now running on better systems with better baseline data, were genuinely stronger. Metro awarded the parks contract to Meridian. $8.4 million over 3 years. My phone rang 11 days after the award was announced. A Tennessee area code I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was Garrett. He left a message that ran 4.5 minutes. The condensed version: Whitfield was having difficulty maintaining communication with 2 of the Metro procurement contacts who'd been primary on the contracts I'd managed. The contacts weren't unresponsive, exactly, but the relationships weren't transferring the way Don had assumed they would. Garrett said he'd really appreciate a conversation, just informal, maybe 30 minutes, to get some guidance on how to approach these relationships going forward. He said Don didn't know he was calling. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. I listened to the message twice, standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. Then I called him back. I told him I was glad to help in a professional consulting capacity. My current rate for external municipal relations consulting was $300 per hour, billed in 2-hour minimums, with a signed engagement letter and a 3-session retainer required before the first call. I told him I could have the paperwork over within a few days if he wanted to move forward. He said he'd have to think about it. He never followed up. Don called 6 times over the following 5 weeks. I let all 6 go to voicemail. The messages followed a pattern: consulting opportunities, bringing my expertise back in some capacity, reasonable compensation, and at a certain point the word loyalty, used more than once. I sat with that word for a full day. Loyalty. 19 years of Sunday calls and early mornings and federal compliance reviews that ate into evenings and weekends. 19 years of treating a company's problems as my problems because I genuinely could not tell the difference anymore. If that wasn't loyalty, I was using the word wrong. And if it was, then Don had received 19 years of it without ever asking what it was costing me to give it. I called him back on a Saturday morning. He picked up on the first ring and started talking before I could say anything about the company, the restructuring, what Garrett was learning, how things were stabilizing, how much had shifted since I left. I waited until there was a pause. I said, "Don, you told me this company carries the Whitfield name. You were right. It always will." I finally went back to mine. I hung up. 3 months later, a reporter from a regional business publication covering the Tennessee construction sector reached out to interview me about Meridian's municipal contract win and the operational methodology behind our bid. We talked for 45 minutes. She asked specific questions about estimating frameworks, relationship management and government procurement, and what distinguished competitive bids in the Metro Nashville market. She quoted me directly and accurately. The article ran on a Thursday. My name in the headline. The estimating model described in detail for the first time in print, attributed correctly. Ray left a framed copy on my desk without saying anything about it. I found it Monday morning. I left it there. I heard through Dana, a few months after that Whitfield Construction had brought in an outside operations consultant to stabilize their project management processes. The 2 Metro procurement contacts they'd been struggling with had both moved forward with Meridian on separate project extensions. Don had pulled back from day-to-day involvement. Garrett was still in the VP role, still learning, still working from a foundation that had been removed from underneath him by its owner on a quiet Friday afternoon in October. I don't spend time thinking about what Whitfield looks like now. I don't need to. What I think about instead is the 19 years I spent building something inside a structure that was never designed to acknowledge what I was building. Not because the work wasn't good. The work was excellent, and everyone in that building knew it. But the structure ran on a different logic, one where the name above the door determined who mattered, regardless of who was actually holding the operation together. I'm not bitter about those years. Being bitter would mean regretting the work, and I don't. The estimating model is real. The municipal relationships are real. The reputation I built with the Metro Procurement Office, one accurate bid, one followed-through project, one problem-solved Sunday phone call, at a time that's real, and it moved with me because it was always mine to begin with. You can be proud of something you built, even if someone else took the credit. You can walk away clean, but only if you've understood, before that moment comes, exactly what belongs to you. So here's what I want to leave with you, because I've thought about it every week since all of this happened. If you are working inside a structure that isn't built to see you a family business, a company where your fingerprints are on everything and your name is on nothing, a place where loyalty flows one direction and gets called a given instead of a choice, you already know what I'm describing. You felt it in the small moment, the meeting where someone else got the credit, the salary conversation that went nowhere, the title that came with no equity and no protection because there was always a reason why this year wasn't the right year. Here is what you do. Know exactly what you own, not what you've contributed to, not what you've been permitted to use. What is documentably, legally, provably yours, your relationships, your methods, your tools, built on your own time, your name in the right clause of the right contract, because the day will come when the structure shifts, and in that moment, the only question that matters is what you actually hold in your hands. Document everything you build. Keep copies of everything you create. Understand the difference between building for a company and giving something away forever, because those are not the same thing, and nobody will tell you that until it's too late. And when you decide to leave, don't leave with anger. Don't burn anything. Don't explain yourself more than once. Leave with the notebook. Leave with the model on the drive. Leave with 19 years of knowledge and relationships and capability that no one thought to protect because they assumed it was theirs by default. Walk out on a Friday afternoon. Let Monday take care of itself.